Calm down before you stress up the groove. The energy a little different when
Great. Hello and welcome to an honest conversation about LGBTQ plus in the UK and Europe. I'm Serena Palmer. I'm the owner of Serena Consulting. We're an organisation specialising in equity, diversity, inclusion, talent and all things leadership, offering coaching, training and strategy solutions. And I'm joined today by a good friend and ex-colleague, actually, Danny Allum, who is going to get involved in this conversation with me around what the current climate is at the moment in terms of LGBTQ issues, what we're hearing in the media and in the corporate world. So, Danny, perhaps I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself properly.
Of course, and thank you for asking me to do this. I really appreciate it. So yes, my name is Danny Allum. My pronouns are he, they. I am a global EDI consultant and queer man living in London.
Fantastic, thank you. And Danny, you know, much like my previous episode on race, we've been having some conversations recently around a bit of a concerning rise in anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment, particularly when it comes to things like legislation across the UK and Europe in recent times. These developments feel like they're really feeding into that climate of fear, which is not necessarily new when it comes to this topic, but it does feel like it's being accelerated. And we've talked also about the impact that that's having on the community and some pretty urgent questions that are being raised about the state of equality in this area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, the only way, you know this as well as I do, to face these issues in a productive way, if we want to foster real change, is through these types of conversations, right? So open, honest, and difficult. And I think that's the biggest thing. Change is scary. People don't like it, but you have to kind of push through that hard bit first if we want to move into a more inclusive society, for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I think that's what you and I will achieve today, because the point of this conversation is exactly as we talk about. Let's have an honest conversation. So let's delve into it. In terms of what you observed, Danny, around sort of anti-discrimination protections being slightly eroded or very much eroded, limitations being presented around LGBTQ plus representation in the education sector in particular. We hear so much about schools. There is a lot of scandalized headlines out there. You know, all children must be referred to as objects or animals, and you know, children identifying as X, Y, and Z, and this kind of really kind of outrageous headline grabbing stuff is rife, right?
Yeah, and there's lots to that. I don't think it's particularly surprising. I think whenever we see progress, what quickly follows is quite a hard pushback on whatever it is. You know, transgender community is kind of at the center of that at the moment. They're getting a lot of the heat within the LGBTQ plus community, and you know, we get a lot of this similar argument. You know, it's happening to everyone. Like you said, there's more. You know, gay children are everywhere and they're on the rise. And why is this happening? And it's because of some insidious agenda. But really, you know, because we have made progress, what we actually have is just more young people feeling confident to say who they are and to talk about these things and to ask questions. We also have more access to science and data and knowledge, not just as, you know, a society, but individually. You know, we were talking earlier about how your phone is permanently on you, right? So you're sort of bombarded with messages and headlines 24/7.
Yeah.
So it feels like it's everywhere, you know, partly because everything is everywhere these days. Yes. But also, you know, what's tricky is that we need to learn to question this information as well in terms of where it's coming from, you know, the source of it. It's very easy for anyone to throw up some kind of attention-grabbing headline and clickbait, but, you know, actually, is it based in fact? Probably not.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've made a really interesting point. So we were reflecting earlier about, you know, it's only in recent history that, you know, being gay, being homosexual was criminalized. It was, you know, people were being put in prison for that. And that's in recent history, and at that point, that also was scandalized. That also, people who were found guilty of were hitting the headlines, and it was met with this sort of shock horror reaction. And yet we fast forward from there, and it feels almost ridiculous now in our society. Certainly, obviously it's not the case around the world necessarily, right? But certainly in the UK, it feels ridiculous to sort of reflect and think, gosh, how shocking it would have been to have learned something about somebody's sexuality in that way. And yet here we are again, particularly when it comes to things like transgender, where we're facing that same change, as you just said. So these difficult challenges come up, and they're often met with resistance as we learn. But the difference now is this bombardment, which isn't just around LGBTQ, it's everything. The news is on all the time, it's on our phones. And so the feeling that we have is that this is much, much bigger than perhaps, it should be. And it's not outrageous to really kind of identify with people who sort of say, but why are there so many transgender children now? And that question comes from the bombardment that we're receiving on a daily, minute by minute basis about this particular matter.
Yeah, for sure. Transgender people aren't new in the same way that gay people aren't new. It's a very easy thread to pull on if someone doesn't want whatever it is to be happening or wants to discredit it. But like I said, everyone has always been here, but it's just the fact that we talk about it more now. We have access to it. People were discussing it in their local, circles or whatever it might be, in government, but actually everyone can tap into that now, like you said, non-stop. So it can feel overwhelming. Even for people who are advocates and activists, burnout is real because it's non-stop. Everything going on in the world can feel exhausting. Sometimes, it's easier just to be like, oh, this is too much, I don't want to deal with it, and I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, that offers a really interesting perspective, Danny, that I don't think we hear enough or anything about, right? So we often hear the argument for and against, and we hear the debate and discussion. But I think what you've just talked to there is a really different angle. So, the experience of people who are advocates, who are out there, very much like yourself, you're a very active person in terms of the community. You do an awful lot. Could you talk to us a little bit then about the work you're involved in, but also how that burnout can feel, where it feels like it's constant?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, EDI is my profession, so I talk about it all day, every day. But then outside of that, I'm the president for a queer men's organisation here in London. So, my spare time, my hobby, if you like, is just more EDI. And then on top of that, I like to use my social media to talk about it, sharing what's going on, challenging people, asking questions, all of that. And so, that is, even for me, 24/7. And if anyone else told me that, I'd be like, you need to calm down a bit, because it's too much. We talk about how allyship is an active word, right? It means doing something. But I think it's very easy to get caught up in the idea that if I don't do something every day, then I'm not doing enough. And there's that pressure because, we don't want to see these awful things happening to anyone, wherever they are in the world. So, but you're no good to someone if you're burnt out. And if, the tighter you get, the less impactful you're going to be. If someone were to challenge you, you might not actually know what you're talking about. You might just feel like, yeah, whatever, I'm just going to kind of agree with you to make this conversation end. So actually acknowledging your own limitations is really, really important, because you're just not going to make any change that way. And you can't change everything. Accepting what you have the power to control and what you don't, where your sphere of influence lies, is really key to doing something useful. And it might be small, but it doesn't mean it's not important.
Yeah. I absolutely identify with that. And, I, in terms of my own experiences, you can, as soon as you mention anything to do with equity, diversity and inclusion, and it being part of your job, in lots of different environments, you can suddenly find yourself being grilled. Oh, well, actually, I've got a viewpoint. And in most instances, you welcome it and you can give a good, well-rounded answer. And I think, people in this business who spend an awful lot of time in it are also pretty good at being able to shut down a conversation as well, so it doesn't overwhelm, you know, if you're meeting friends in the pub, that you don't have to have the whole night debating these issues. But occasionally I have definitely experienced just that sinking feeling where I know I don't have the brain power that day, that minute, to be able to respond properly, and have definitely found myself in the trap where but because of that duty that you talked about, that allyship that is really important, you make yourself, and then you end up doing a bit of a bad job of something and coming across a bit grumpy or defensive. And then actually it would have been it would have been better, right, to have just sort of said, you know, we can talk about that another time.
For sure. And actually, you know, one of the fundamental lessons that I've had to learn throughout my career is you can never enter any of these conversations with the intention of changing someone's mind, because you've kind of already lost. You know, we know, and something that we have preached and talked about is that EDI, inclusion, you know, what you're working towards is an individual duty. So we as professionals can give the information, we can give the context, we can provide a learning platform if that's what's needed. But at the end of the day, people are going to either pick that up and run with it, or they're going to completely ignore you. What I find fascinating about EDI specifically as a specialism is that even people who don't agree with you kind of like talking about it, because they obviously want to get their side across, and you get challenged in a way that other professionals don't, because they don't always credit you with the expertise that you have. And so for me, it's learning to not fall down that rabbit hole. You know, I'll be like, oh, this is a fact. Did you know that this is true? And if someone starts throwing 100 different reasons why it's not correct at me, what I try and do now is just be like, okay, I know it is true. You know, there are studies, there are facts, there's information out there that you have the ability to go and get. I've given you the truth. I've given you what I think, and that's kind of the end of it. I'm not responsible for anything more than that.
Yeah. I think I love that viewpoint, you know, remembering that in any of these situations, you're not going in with an agenda to change somebody's mind, because ultimately that is out of our control. It's out of anybody's control, regardless of the topic. Really healthy. I think it's good to have that perspective, because I don't think we hear so much about that. It can be exhausting. And you know, you need to make choices about which discussions and how much energy you give to it. And I think that then brings me nicely back to corporate life, companies and businesses who have gone through quite the journey, you know, and I won't bore everybody to death, but, you know, my first experience as an HR practitioner when D&I became its own subject matter was a one-person job, not a team, regardless of the size of the business. So, you know, I was working for a big telco business at that time. They got on the train, the first wave of, we need somebody to actually focus on diversity and inclusion. That was one person, and it was given to somebody who had a particular interest, passion in that subject, with no prior kind of existing, you know, training. That really wasn't a thing. It was seen as somebody who was just a passionate advocate for that role. And, you know, fast forward from there, that one role went through its own difficult journey. A lot of people would view them as the D&I police. So if that person came to a meeting, it's because we were all going to get told off, or, you know, and it was very much a wagging finger type of perception, regardless of who was doing it and how they were doing it. That's what the business viewed it. And there was a lot of eyeball rolling and, you know, oh no, here come the D&I police. And then people started to get the message, as we also saw employee advocate groups come up, and we saw people really championing, actually, we want more than just this one person struggling to do D&I for an entire organization, because we've got big agendas over here. And then we've seen that role evolve and change to where we now have had established D&I teams, with a senior position that influence the business, that have a hard and fast data-driven reason, that remind organizations that businesses that have a diverse workforce and a diverse leadership team make more money. Fact. When that's kind of accepted, we've seen the huge evolution of EDI, as we call it now, so equity first, diversity and inclusion. However, as I reflect on the last sort of probably maybe 10 months or so, with what's been happening in the political arena, we're seeing a backtrack of that. And we've had some really unhelpful things from the UK government. You know, if it's, I remember the lovely Suella Braverman sort of stating that, you know, she intended to get rid of all the D&I employees working in the civil service because she once did a D&I course that she thought was rubbish, you know. And that narrative is playing out. You know, if government leads with that, then businesses who weren't convinced anyway certainly are not going to invest. And we've seen now a sort of a roll back of EDI as a function, a specialism with power and influence. What do you think, Danny, when you sort of look around at organizations, what are you kind of picking up in the corporate world around this environment of change?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that these topics really awaken people's fight or flight response, right? So some companies will lean right into it. We need to do something. What should we do? Other people just completely ignore it because it terrifies them. You know, they start saying things like politics don't belong in the office. And that might be a senior leader. It might just be employees en masse. And I think part of it comes down to this misunderstanding around conflict. So what you've just said, you know, it makes me laugh when, you know, like the EDI police, that's something that you get a lot, right? Or the fun police or whatever it might be, the PC police, because people think conflict is bad, and actually healthy conflict is necessary to success. And even if you take EDI out of it, you know, innovation is about thinking in new ways and asking different questions and challenging what's come before. So businesses like doing it. You know, innovation is a whole sector. But when you then sort of add EDI onto it, it just freaks people out. And it's this idea that people think that they're being judged as a person. They think that they're going to do everything wrong. They don't know what the right thing to do is. Like you said, they think they don't see it as business critical, and it is. You know, if I'm thinking about LGBT rights specifically, it's a funny one because I think it's kind of somewhere in the middle in terms of topics people find easy to talk about. Gender, I think, is probably one of the easiest things. Everyone believes in gender equity, or most people do, you know, closing the gender pay gap for women, that kind of stuff. That's really easy. It's an easy sell. Things like race sit right on the other side, and LGBT sits in the middle because, in essence, a lot of people are like, yeah, it's fine. We don't really care. You know, they'll wear a rainbow lanyard. They'll do those things. But, you know, when you then move away from just simply visibility and you talk about the harder work, you know, they're not really willing to do it. You know, are you reviewing your parental policy so it's appropriate for families? You know, that suddenly is costing time and money, and, you know, no business wants to give up those things because there's always something else that they feel like they can spend it on or focus on. So it then becomes a sort of it's a selling exercise, right? And like you just said, we know that diverse teams and inclusive cultures are actually better for business on every single front. You just have to, you know, make people aware of that fact.
Yeah. And so I guess if we focus that on the LGBTQ community and this rollback that we're seeing, EDI broadly, but specifically in the issues that are pertinent to the LGBTQ plus community, you know, what is the cost of that, do you think, Danny, in terms of, you know, the challenge around the ethics of a transgender individual getting a job with children in school and some of those headline grabbing things? What is the impact that you think we see on a human perspective?
On the LGBT people specifically?
Yeah.
I mean, look, if we want to be really direct, the impact is the loss of life. Like, you know, LGBT adults are at high risk of suicidal thoughts and self-harm. Over half of LGBT people experience depression, and that's even higher for trans people. But also loss of life through attacks and discrimination. You know, even in London, where, you know, people feel relatively safe. Last year, there were multiple hate crimes in areas that are generally considered to be LGBT friendly. So that is, you know, the most extreme thing that can happen. You know, and people just, and apart from that, the quality of life is less. So, if you're constantly waking up to headlines, or even just casually going to grab your coffee in your kitchen at work, and you're hearing people questioning your existence as a person, there's no way that doesn't have an impact on you. So, that's the full spectrum of it. I think it's just we're going to see less people in the world.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's very easy to skirt around the level of impact, right? This is not just let's have a bit of an argy-bargy in the canteen at work about whether we agree, disagree, and and play to the headlines about toilets and pronouns. This is much more serious than that. This is, as you quite rightly said, this is impacting people's mental health and ultimately loss of life. When we see hate on the rise, it's deeply troubling. And we discussed this in terms of race in the last episode, because what, the impact there was, for employees, people of colour, they suddenly had to question if they were safe to go out of the house and travel to work that day because of the rising level of aggression, violence and hate. So it's pretty serious, right? It's more than just a headline story.
Absolutely. And, that really kind of links back to what I said before about those who say that politics don't belong in the office. It's like, well, we're talking about every individual who walks in that door every day. So it absolutely is linked to it. And there's no way it doesn't impact the workplace, the workforce, whatever, as well as the people individually.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, you encourage people to challenge or to be curious about some of the things that they're reading. And we all know intellectually that on social media in particular, there's an algorithm at play. So if you spent a while reading a headline grabber, like, all children are having to be referred to as they, for example, if you do that, then you'll get sent more and more content, right? So it's difficult to help people move beyond that and be curious to get, information that they can trust. What advice or guidance would you give anybody, regardless of in work or out of work, in terms of fact checking and avoiding getting looped into confirmation bias?
Yeah, I think, it boils down to the one of the fundamental principles of EDI, which is that no one knows everything, and we're always learning and unlearning and relearning, right? Even us as individuals. If I were to go deliver a session on LGBT rights, 6 months after I did one, I'm checking my content to make sure that it all still feels appropriate and correct. Are my statistics still right? Have things changed? And there's a little bit of being humble in that way. So, I've read this, I know it, therefore I'm going to spout it as if it's correct. So just acknowledging that fact, because it's true for everyone, and it's not a bad thing, and it's actually a really healthy thing. So just making sure, if we're talking social media, you can do research into, the best accounts to follow. And what's important is that not just the accounts, what they look like, but who runs them, what's their intention as well, right? When we talk, if we think about the UK media en masse, we know that we're talking about publications that go into people's houses en masse every day, that are owned by like 3 people who are all very similar politically. So how much of a balanced view are you really getting? So, and I didn't know that. I grew up in a very rural, conservative white town, and the Sun newspaper used to come into our house every day. And I read that and was like, well, that's the news. That's fact. I trust this because it's the newspaper. And it wasn't until I got older and started learning about this kind of stuff that I was then, oh, actually, hold on. What is this? And is there something else I come in looking at? So everyone's on their journey with it, but you just have to question it. Read something, even if it's positive, you check. It's not just like, oh, this is a bad thing. Before I go and say, oh, this really good thing's happened, let me just double check it with something else. So just always backing it up. And, even if you're not sure, there'll always be someone you can ask. The internet is everywhere as well. Everyone has access to ask that question. So just make sure you are asking that question.
Yeah, ask the question. Absolutely. And I would add one other thing onto that, which is use your common sense and what you can see in front of you. So, you know, my favorite, probably overused analogy is, you know, within our lifetimes, being left-handed, being born as a left-handed child was really a big problem. So, you know, my dad's left-handed. His experience at school was being told that he was wrong to be left-handed. He was bad, possessed by the devil, all sorts of strange religious connotations, and forced to use his right hand in any method that they could force him to do that. And at that point, there was identified around about 7% of the population were left-handed. Okay, when we stopped beating children for using their left hand, and we stopped telling them that they were evil, bad, wrong, stupid for using their left hand, the population of left-handed people went up to 12%. And then it kind of leveled off. And that's where it is. That's the truth of it, right?
Yeah.
And that analogy can be applied to any change in society. So when we stop beating people, telling them they're bad, wrong, etc., and we allow them to be safe and who they are, the numbers will go up because they're no longer hiding and terrified to be themselves, but then they will level off. And it's exactly so that whole, like, why are there so many XYZ, you know, it's because we are gradually eroding that fear and allowing people to be their genuine selves. It's not a disease that they caught left-handedness. They were born left-handed, you know.
Exactly. You know, like we said, transgender youth are there, whether you want them to openly acknowledge it or not. It doesn't make them not transgender. You're just trying to make it someone else's problem.
Yeah. Perfect.
Completely.
I love that. Danny, I'm going to close us off with, I'm going to ask in terms of, you know, you are a leading voice in this field. You do an awful lot, as you've told us, in terms of professionally and personally. And if you were able to speak to the sort of senior board in an organization and kind of give them your top tips for fostering a really inclusive environment for LGBTQ plus employees at work, what is it you would be saying to them that will help everybody feel respected, valued, and safe?
I think just that equity has to be built into the foundation of your company. You know that as I do, that EDI is often seen as a nice to have, and it's added on with all the best intentions. You know, people who might be new to the journey or want to make positive change will be like, okay, well, let's make this decision and then we'll look at it through an EDI lens. And it's just never going to work out long term. So, you know, we're talking about ways of working, decision making, policies, processes, talent acquisition, all these things. And you have to dedicate money, time, and resources to it. I think employee networks and that kind of ground level, you know, action is really important, especially in terms of visibility. And visibility is important. I'm not saying don't do those things. You know, if I, as a queer man, was looking at a new job, I'm going to see if I can recognize anything around EDI on a website. You know, what do I see? Is it visible? Are they showing me from the start that they care about this? But unless you have senior buy-in, you're not going to make any substantial change. So that's where you have to focus. It has to be top down.
Yeah. I love it. Thank you so much. And, you know, it really is about that. It's about genuine investment. And it's always worth remembering in any business, small, medium, large, when prospective candidates are checking you out, they are also checking out your equity, diversity, and inclusion policies. They are looking at the faces who are in those senior leader positions and doing their homework in that way. So I think that's a really healthy reminder.
Absolutely. And, you know, I would say to senior leaders as well, be okay with not knowing everything. I think there's a lot of pressures on leaders to be that fountain of knowledge, right? Whereas if I walked up to a senior leader and said, hey, what are we doing about LGBT inclusion? I'm going to respect and work with a leader who says, that's a really good question, I don't know, or we could probably do more. That's what I want to hear, as opposed to someone who tries to give me a non-answer in terms of why it's not important, or, you know, act like they know, but it's just not relevant. Like that for me is a red flag. So
yeah,
lean into not knowing. That's okay.
Yeah, which is exactly what you would do if you had a finance question and you weren't a finance expert, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Same rules apply.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, you know, Thank you so much. I hope this has been a really enlightening conversation for those watching, and reach out. I think, as you said, Danny, if you don't know the answer and you want to help, you want to get help, then reach out and ask. And there's so much help and support out there. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Danny.
Thank you.